In the year 2000, China barely existed in Africa. No factories, no roads, no ports, no military bases, no universities. Total trade between China and the entire African continent, $10 billion a year. Less than the trade turnover of an average European country with a single partner. 25 years later, China has built more infrastructure in Africa than Europe did in 200 years of colonial rule. The Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, the Port of Mombasa in Kenya, the Marau Dam in Sudan, stadiums in 30 countries, hospitals, universities, parliamentary buildings, presidential palaces. Total trade today, $280 billion a year, a 28-fold increase in a quarter of a century. While the West was lecturing Africa about democracy and human rights, China was building roads. While Europe was debating loan conditions, China was already opening factories. While Washington was hosting summits, Beijing was signing contracts. And today, when African leaders sit down at the negotiating table, they are not choosing between a good partner and a bad one. They are choosing between the one who comes with conditions and the one who comes with cranes. How did this happen in 25 years? Who really won? And who will pay the price? And most importantly, is this the liberation of Africa or simply a change of master? The next 18 minutes will change the way you look at the map of the world. To understand how China entered Africa, you first need to understand what the West left behind. The 1990s. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Africa has lost its strategic significance for both superpowers. It is no longer a battlefield between capitalism and communism. And the West essentially left, not physically. The IMF and World Bank stayed. French troops stayed. British advisors stayed. But their genuine interest in the real development of Africa evaporated. What replaced it? Conditions. Endless conditions. Want a loan for a hospital? First, privatize your state enterprises. Want help building a road? First, reform your judicial system. Want investment? First, prove compliance with transparency standards designed in Washington by people who had never set foot in your country. This was called conditionality policy. And in practice, it meant one thing: the money never arrived, or arrived so late and with so many restrictions that the project either never launched or was plundered during the approval process. By the end of the 1990s, African leaders, from Ethiopia to Angola, from Senegal to Zimbabwe, were deeply disillusioned with their Western partners. Not because the West was cruel, but because the West was useless. Roads were not being built, power stations were not being raised, ports were rotting, and it was precisely at this moment, into this specific vacuum of disappointment and unmet needs, that China stepped in. October 2000, Beijing, the first Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. 80 ministers from 44 African states flew to the Chinese capital, many for the first time, most with cautious curiosity. China did not lecture. China did not demand reforms as a precondition for conversation. China offered one simple thing: partnership without political conditions. This sounded almost unbelievable to people accustomed to every dollar of Western aid coming attached to a 100-page list of requirements. But China backed its words with action. Immediately. Debt cancellation, right there and then. $10 billion of African debt to China, annulled on the spot at the forum. Tariff concessions. Exports from the least developed African countries to China. Duty-free. Scholarships. Thousands of African students to Chinese universities, free of charge. And most importantly, a promise of infrastructure. Not reports, not recommendations, not technical assistance, physical infrastructure, the kind you can touch with your hands. African ministers flew home with a different feeling from the negotiations. For the first time in a long time, they had not been taught. They had been spoken to as equals, and the machine began to turn. But before we talk about results, we need to understand the mechanism, because China's strategy in Africa is not altruism. It is not imperialism in the old sense. It is something fundamentally new, and that is precisely why the West took so long to find an answer to it. The Chinese model operates through three instruments simultaneously. The first instrument, resource-backed loans. China comes to an African government with an offer. We will build you a road, a port, a railway, a dam, a 20-year loan at a low interest rate. The repayment condition is not reforms, not privatization, not elections. The repayment condition is natural resources: oil, copper, cobalt, timber. Angola in 2004 received $2 billion in Chinese loans for post-Civil War reconstruction. The collateral: oil. Chinese construction companies immediately began building roads and hospitals. The IMF at the same time refused Angola a loan due to non-compliance with transparency conditions. The Angolan government made the obvious choice. The second instrument: Chinese workers and companies. When China builds in Africa, it brings its own engineers, its own workers, its own construction companies, its own materials. Local employment is often minimal. This criticism is fair. Africans do not always get jobs from Chinese projects, but infrastructure, they do get. And this, as it turned out, matters more to most governments than the question of whose hands build it. The third instrument: diplomacy without memory. China does not remember the past. It does not matter who is in power. It does not matter how they got there, through elections or a coup. China works with whoever governs the country today. This is valued in a world where Western partners are capable of freezing all cooperation after a change of regime. And here are the results of these three instruments in action. Ethiopia. The Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, 756 kilometers. The first electrified railway in sub-Saharan Africa, built by Chinese companies, financed by Chinese banks, opened in 2017. Before it, the journey from the Ethiopian capital to the nearest port took 3 days. Now, 10 hours. Kenya. The standard gauge railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, 480 kilometers. The largest infrastructure project in Kenyan history since independence. Cost: $3.8 billion. Financing: the Chinese Exim Bank, 90%. Zambia, copper mining. Chinese companies control a significant share of the country's copper mining industry. Its largest export earner, DRC Cobalt. The largest cobalt mining contracts belong to Chinese companies. In the country that holds 70% of global reserves of the metal, without which electric vehicle batteries are impossible. And this is only infrastructure and mining, because simultaneously, China was building something even more strategic in Africa: soft power. 120 Confucius Institutes across Africa, centers for studying the Chinese language and culture. Today, Mandarin is one of the fastest-growing languages by number of learners on the continent. Chinese media, CGTN Africa. Chinese state television in English has become one of the most watched news channels on the continent. 60,000 African students study in China every year. They return home with connections, with language skills, with an understanding of how the Chinese system works. In 20 years, those students will be African ministers, bank directors, editors-in-chief. Beijing understood this from the very beginning. But here the story takes a turn that destroys both the Western narrative and the Chinese one. Because reality turned out to be more complicated than either of them promised. 2017, Sri Lanka. The country cannot repay its Chinese debt on the port of Hambantota. The loan terms are harsh. There are no alternatives. The solution? Sri Lanka hands the port to China on a 99-year lease. This is not Africa, but the signal traveled around the world. Debt trap. The term entered the international lexicon, and the eyes of analysts turned to Africa with a new question: Zambia. By 2020, the country had accumulated a critical level of external debt, a significant portion owed to Chinese creditors. Debt restructuring negotiations, painful and prolonged. Fears emerged that China might gain control of the state energy company in lieu of debt repayment. That ultimately did not happen, but the tension was real. Kenya. It emerged that the loan agreement for the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway contained a clause stating that in the event of default, China could claim management of the port of Mombasa. the country's main maritime gateway. Ethiopia by 2021 found itself in a situation where servicing its debt to China was absorbing a significant portion of its foreign currency reserves. The picture began to look different. Not simply China builds roads in Africa, but China builds roads in Africa, and may be building them for itself. But, and here is the crucial nuance that gets lost in most Western reporting, there is no systematic evidence that China used debts to seize African infrastructure. A 2021 study by American University analyzed 160 Chinese loan contracts with African countries. The conclusion, yes, the terms are tough. Yes, collateral clauses exist. But not a single African asset has actually been seized by China in lieu of debt. Reality is more complex than the narrative. Chinese loans created debt burdens. That is true. But Western loans through the IMF had been creating debt burdens for decades, plus destroying social systems through structural adjustment programs. African governments remember this. And when they are told, beware of Chinese debt traps, the response often sounds something like, explain to us how this is different from the trap we have been sitting in for 50 years. This is the moment of highest tension in the entire story. Not because China is a good or bad partner, but because Africa has found itself, for the first time in centuries, in a position where it has a real choice, and it is using it. In 2023, when Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso were expelling French troops, they did not automatically invite China to replace them. They negotiated with China, with Russia, with Turkey, with India. This is the new geopolitical reality of Africa. Not China is taking over Africa, but Africa has learned to play its partners against each other. So, let us take stock. What has China actually gained from Africa in 25 years? Access to critical raw materials for its own industry: cobalt, copper, oil, timber. On terms the West would never have agreed to. A market for Chinese goods, from smartphones to construction equipment. 54 votes at the United Nations. The African bloc voted with China on Taiwan, on Xinjiang, on critical Human Rights Council resolutions. Strategic naval presence, a base in Djibouti, China's first overseas military base in history. A foothold for the next century, when the African economy grows to the scale we discussed in the previous video. But what did Africa get? Infrastructure that did not exist before. Real, physical, tangible, an alternative to Western loan conditions, which by itself transformed the continent's negotiating power. A new elite that speaks Mandarin, which will define the next 30 years of African politics. An experience, bitter, but valuable. An understanding that no external partner arrives without their own interests. Not China, not the West, not Russia. Everyone comes for something. The difference is in how much they try to hide it. And that understanding is the most valuable thing Africa has extracted from 25 years of Chinese presence. Because a country that understands what others want from it can set a price. A country that does not understand simply gives things away. In 1885 in Berlin, there were no Africans at the table. In 2025, African leaders receive Xi Jinping, Biden, Erdogan, Putin, and say much the same thing to each of them. What are you prepared to offer us? This is not China's victory over the West. This is Africa's victory over both of them. And this is only the beginning. If you watched our previous videos about the stolen 50 trillion and about why Africa will dominate by 2100, this story is the third piece of the same puzzle. How it was taken, why it is not the end, and who is now fighting for the next chapter.